welcome to everybody to this press conference of ACEA. We're living, of course, in quite interesting times these days, also for the automotive industry. But one of the things which come out clearly from the motor show here in Frankfurt is, and I think it impressed everybody, is the high level of innovation and the diversity of innovation that our industry continues to bring to the market and continues to lead, because often in discussions reference is made to markets outside Europe. Europe stands on the map, continues to take a leadership role when it comes to being innovative, when it comes to implementing the big trends facing our industry, be it digitalization or decarbonization. But without further ado, I think it's important to give here the floor to our president, Dieter Zetsche, who will give you some perspective also on where we are in the discussion on decarbonization. Mr. Zetsche.
Thank you, Eric, and hello everyone, and welcome to the ACEA press conference. Today is not just the third day of the International Motor Show, IAA, it's also the International Positive Thinking Day. Although this day might not be too well known, I like the message. It's meant to encourage people to face difficult situations with a positive attitude. That's definitely the right mindset, especially for those of us who work in the auto industry. At ACEA, we have a very positive stance on the future, not despite diesel, but also because of it. However, I'm aware that diesel technology is currently a hot issue and urban access restrictions are on consideration across the EU, for example, on days of poor air quality. We are convinced that countries and cities facing air quality problems should work on an EU-wide harmonized approach to mitigate them. This would help to maintain a single market and to avoid customer confusion. Just imagine on your next vacation, you and your family have to cross 3 different European borders to reach your destination, and each time you enter another country and then another city, you would have to deal with a different set of air regulations. ACEA's member companies want to contribute to improving local air quality in our cities and to avoid urban access restrictions. Therefore, we are ready to engage at the EU level with the European Commission and other industrial stakeholders on effective common solutions. That's also why we fully support the recently introduced real-world driving emission test. With RDE, there's one single EU-wide test to measure on the road pollutant emissions of cars. This should prevent the confusion which would be created by different sets of definitions and requests by local governments, cities, and others using a multitude of different tests. To this end, RDE provides more transparency for customers and citizens because it covers a broad variety of driving situations. I assure you, our industry is committed to be a part of a European-wide solution when it comes to reducing pollutant emissions. Therefore, we will continue to push innovations to make our cars even cleaner and more efficient. The introduction of the latest generation of diesel vehicles, supported by fleet renewal plans, is an important part of this commitment. Their very low pollutant emissions on the road and their excellent performance can play a very strong role in helping cities move towards compliance with EU air quality targets. At the same time, the latest generation of diesel vehicles is crucial for our continuous efforts to decarbonize road transport. They are the most effective mass market solution today because they emit 15 to 20% less CO2 than equivalent petrol vehicles. And as long as the minimal market share of electric vehicles does not rapidly and significantly increase, diesel remains the most effective lever to achieve climate goals in the near future. Therefore, any rash move away from this technology will make it more difficult for our industry to meet the European Commission's targets. By 2021, car fleets have to meet the target level of 95 grams CO2 per kilometer and 147 grams for van fleets. However, there are no set targets for the post-2021 period. That's why the Commission is currently working on a new proposal for post-2021 CO2 levels or targets. As President of ACEA, I would like to outline the 5 key aspects of our position to this proposal. First, we favor a clear and foreseeable timeframe. 2021 should be the baseline and 2030 should be the deadline. This would give our industry the lead time it needs to plan for required strategic investments and to develop products and technologies based on the new WLTP lab test to measure CO2 emissions. Moreover, it would give EU member states and all stakeholders sufficient time to implement the necessary steps to ensure a higher uptake of alternatively powered vehicles. When it comes to reducing CO2, our industry has already made major progress in the past. By 2021, CO2 reductions from new cars sold since 2005 will amount to a full 42%. This brings me to my second point. The post-2021 CO2 reduction targets for passenger cars should be set at further 20% by 2030. This is a steep reduction. It's in line with what is expected of other industry sectors as well as with the EU climate and energy framework targets, not to mention the global Paris Agreement. Third, CO2 emission targets from light-duty vehicles should be reduced in an adjusted way due to their specific situation. Fourth, we propose a conditional CO2 emission reduction target for the year 2030. The target should be based on both the market uptake of alternatively powered vehicles and the build-up of a comprehensive charging and refueling infrastructure. That means that if electric vehicles would be accepted by customers to a higher extent than assumed in their target setting, then the target could become even more ambitious, and vice versa. In our opinion, this conditionality principle links Europe's long-term climate objectives to the reality of the market. When it comes to the market uptake of electric vehicles, we need to look at reality. And the reality is the market uptake for these vehicles remains low at that point of time, although not due to lack of availability and choices. All ACEA members are currently expanding their portfolios of electric vehicles. You can see proof of that on display here in Frankfurt. In addition to producing electric vehicles, we also need to consider factors that are beyond our industry's responsibilities, such as investments in the requisite recharging and refueling infrastructure. Still, an alliance of car manufacturers is investing together in the build-up of 400 fast charging stations in Europe to help jumpstart this effort and show our commitment to decarbonizing road transport. This demonstrates once again our industry is ready to undertake every effort to increase market uptake and market e-mobility to become a success. But we also need to continue to improve combustion engines if we want to have a chance to successfully meet the post-2021 CO2 emission targets. Of course, we European car manufacturers are working hard to deliver those improvements as well. And last but not least, my fifth point, the European Commission's proposal for the post-2021 CO reduction targets should also include a mid-term review in the year 2025. Much as we are moving to real-world testing of emissions, this would allow for the real-world assessment of the market uptake of alternatively powered cars and vans, as well as investments in the recharging infrastructure across the EU. It just makes too much sense. That's why, to sum it all up, I believe ACEA's position is a well-balanced initiative and makes a positive contribution to the Commission's proposal. Our industry is committed to being part of the solution when it comes to decarbonizing road transport, while at the same time reducing pollutant emissions. Much is at stake here, but I'm confident we will ultimately succeed. And I don't simply say this because it's the International Positive Thinking Day. Thank you very much.
your questions. Just to remind you that this is an ACEA press conference, so we're happy to take your questions about the European automobile industry as a whole, but we won't be able to take company-specific questions. So with that, if you just say your name and media outlet. Yes? So.
Nick Gibbs, Automotive News Europe. What targets on electric vehicles would you need to meet to revise your conditional target up or down?
I mean, first of all, of course, we are not in the position to know the overall industry situation in meeting their 21 target of 95 CO2. That's obviously different for every single company. We cannot exchange this data. And therefore, we don't know how tight or even impossible these targets are to be met as a starting point for the further improvement we are seeing. We are discussing what should be set as the median point of electric uptake to confirm the 20% reduction target, and from that median then have a higher target or a lower target if the uptake would develop differently. This, you can perhaps say something about this percentage.
Okay, we first of all, at the end of the day, this is going to be part of the discussion also with the Commission and member states. We want to also make sure in when we are finalizing, because what we share with you is the building blocks of a proposal, so we need to still see how this is moving forward. But what we want to also make sure, as we're going to have the discussions at European level, is that we take into account where all member states are in Europe. I mean, it's clear that when it comes to uptake, market uptake of, for instance, alternative powered vehicles, and more particularly electric vehicles, the situation is different from country to country in Europe. We cannot just assume that everybody is like the Netherlands or like Germany or like Norway. So we need to make sure that in this move towards a European solution and progress at European level, we bring everybody on board. And that is, of course, a difficult exercise, especially because we see currently different countries are in different places for the moment. If you look at the sales figures of electric vehicles, for instance, last year, you see less than 0.5% in some of the Central European countries, where it's around 1% in others, or more than 1% in others. So there is a big difference. So in this exercise, and if we are serious, and there is a lot of commitment in our industry to move forward, we need to make sure that we move forward together. And this will try to make sure we can include all countries. That underlines also the importance of the need to create the right enabling instruments, such as the need for recharging infrastructure. That's one of the drivers to build consumer confidence in e-mobility.
Okay, I have one question here, and then over here to the side.
Roger Atkins, Electric Vehicles Outlook.
Thank you. Roger Atkins, Electric Vehicles Outlook. Would the Chinese approach of production quotas impact at all on your thinking? And obviously there's been a lot of discussion and debate on that, the initial 8%, or what actually it turns out to be. Is that likely to impact on your thinking in any sense as we go through the next few years?
ACEA has a clear position on that one, that it doesn't believe that this is a helpful instrument. First of all, we are over-determining our path forward when we come from three different angles to define the ultimate goal, which I think is the definite role of policymakers to set clear targets, how, in which inclination the CO2 emissions and the other pollutant emissions should develop. That is definitely what the legislator has to define. And then I do believe that the technology, the innovation, and the market forces should find the best, most effective, and fastest way to meet their targets. And anything which is interacting with this dynamic, which has proven over many, many decades to be pretty effective, would not help to achieve that target. And therefore, we do believe to come up with a clear-cut definition about, as we just discussed, this path towards 2030, and discussing enabling factors to accelerate the electrification, like the infrastructure build-up, is the right path. and not precluding any future innovation which we might have in 2 and 5 and 8 years for other contributions to reduce CO2 as well.
Thank you.
Okay. The gentleman here, you have a question, Arena?
Yes, Jean-Philippe Lacour from Agence France Presse, Mr. Secce. When it comes to define this post-2021 CO2 standards, won't you fear that the environmental lobby could prevail to, at the end of the day, impose much tougher standards that your industry wish to have?
The task of policymakers is to include all parts of the society to ultimately come to the best possible solutions. This, of course, implies that they have to include all aspects which are relevant to the society where the rules are made for. And there's no doubt whatsoever that the environment is a very high priority aspect to be considered, and that COP21 in Paris, I think and we think, was a very positive one where on a global basis there was a consensus to move into a certain direction which has not been accomplished in many other areas, so that's very positive. That has to be a very important priority in the overall target setting. But I think we all agree as well that, for instance, the question of the competitiveness of the European industry and the question of safeguarding and ideally growing the labor market in Europe is another important element to consider in this context. And there are other aspects. And therefore, our role and objective is to try to explain the correlations between moves in one direction and consequence out of that in all aspects, explain what kind of potential we are seeing in technology, and therefore giving our input. And the role of NGOs is to give their input from their perspective as far as the environment is concerned, which we, of course, include in our thinking as well. And I do believe and hope that NGOs include in their thinking labor markets and other aspects as well. But we have different roles. And now the legislator ultimately has the role to balance all of these together and come to a conclusion. And we trust and we are confident that the lawmakers will live up to that task and come up with a result where we all can live with in a positive way.
Okay, we have one question at the back, then one here and one at the front.
Yeah. My name's Kjeld Louis. I'm from Mornevisen in Denmark. Looking at it from a consumer side, a lot of consumers, when it comes to diesel cars, have a great deal of uncertainty. And you said that diesel is crucial in the coming years. What will the ASEA do to alleviate this uncertainty, given that a lot of politicians are talking about banning diesels in major cities? And if this uncertainty persists, will the ASEA members be willing to guarantee a resale value of a car in order to make the diesel cars still attractive?
I think the first very important element of regenerating confidence and trust and transparency is certainly the RDE regulation with clear and unquestionable definitions what is the emission level of a vehicle. And therefore we're 100% supporting that regulation which has been developed by the Commission and the other parties involved in the European lawmaking. And it's just coming into effect these days. And therefore, again, this is one important element to avoid confusion. Secondly to that, there must be offerings which are able to fulfill these requirements of this regulation and demonstrate that diesel engines, from a technological point of view, can be basically as clean as gasoline engines, while still offering this 15 to 20% advantage in CO2. We have, as an industry, engines, early and first engines of that kind, where NGOs confirm as well that these are clean diesel engines and they are ready for the future. So that is the second element. And on top of that, we are talking about the past, which is probably the most difficult part. And that's about responsibility. There's about protection of the customers. And these are discussions where there are no simple solutions. And I got it, this we do, and everything is solved. But that's a process where we are in the midst of, and where some elements and some steps which have been taken have shown or created some progress. Some other influencing factors which are time-based and to some extent condition-based, like, for instance, election times and things like that, are less supporting the more factual discussion. But overall, I hope that, and I'm sure that facts will prevail and that we will come to conclusions, and we are very far advanced in this regard, to deal with the customers concerned about past vehicles being sold in the past and their ongoing value as well.
But perhaps if I may add to that, an important element to avoid the confusion in Europe is going to be that we need urgently a coherent European framework to avoid the current chaos we see in Europe, triggered by all kinds of, I'm not saying bans, but restrictions on diesel, which are different from city to city, from country to country, creating really confusion with consumers. We understand there are concerns to be addressed. We want to be part of the solution, as Mr. Zetsche already said. So that's why we have offered to the European Commission the idea to work with them to see what we can do together to create at least a more coherent framework that are, instead of the chaos in which citizens are operating today in Europe when it comes to diesel vehicles.
I mean, the one target which was set by the very early beginning of European collaboration was their internal market with common frameworks. And that's the one thing where everybody agrees throughout the last many decades. And that's the one which is in that aspect endangered right now.
Okay, we're coming to a close, but I think we can take one last quite quick question.
Yes, Susanne Röder, self-employed journalist on automotive issues. My recurring question, which I would also like to pose to the two of you, how about synthetic fuels? They are at best mentioned, but why are we not pursuing synthetic fuels, invest more money towards synthetic synfuels rather than investing into all kinds of different premier issues and all that? Because they are climate neutral. You know, the Bosch press release, for instance, I don't hear it, I don't read it, politicians aren't fed with it. It's a bit of a non-end, it seems to me. So what's your positive thinking on that one?
First of all, what we say is one thing, and what you read is another thing. And in between are the ones who are writing. I totally agree with you that obviously there is a possibility to use the carbon in the air and combine it with hydrogen and come up with fuels, which when then the carbon gets to the air again is a closed circle and does not add to the CO2 level in the air. In more general terms, that's what I meant before, that we should not, by policymakers, mandate the technologies and the paths, how to get the common agreed goal of reducing CO2 plus the other pollutants. We are early stages in this regard as far as cost is concerned and mass market, but it's a very, very interesting alternative, which would require less investment in new driveline technologies and, quite frankly, have the benefit of having an immediate impact because obviously we all know that electric vehicles at that point of time do not reduce the CO2 impact, not significantly, because of the CO2 emission related to the production of batteries and the CO2 emission related to power generation. So this is a new system which first has to grow with all its elements to really have the impact. So more generally, that's why I said before, let's agree on what we really want to accomplish. Less emissions, CO2 and pollutant emissions, and then let's work all together to have the fastest, most effective way to come to these targets. And knowing that we don't know today what the final solution is, and this might be one additional path, and probably it's not either or, but all of the above, to come to this conclusion. And that's why, again, I think that mandating certain percentages of certain technologies doesn't take us in the best way to that solution.
Okay, with that, we have to close, I'm afraid. Thank you very much, Dr. Zetsche, Mr. Jonait. Mr. Jonait is available for some follow-up questions for the next 10 minutes or so, but Dr. Zetsche has to leave. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.